Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're taking on a topic that honestly might seem a bit dry at first glance: elasticity in economics.
Yeah, I can see how it might not sound like the most thrilling thing in the world.
Right. But trust me, this isn't about dusty textbooks or complicated formulas. Well, okay, maybe there are some formulas. But the point is, this is about understanding how the world around us actually
It's
works.
like a behind-the-scenes look at how prices change, why businesses make the decisions they do, and even how we as consumers react to those decisions.
Exactly. And all we're using to guide us today are these notes on elasticity. So, to pick things off, what's the big idea behind elasticity? What are we really talking about here?
At its core, elasticity is about figuring out how sensitive one thing is to changes in something else. Like, imagine a coffee shop suddenly raises its prices.
Ooh, painful thought. But okay, I'm imagining it.
So the question is, will people still buy as much coffee at that higher price, or will they start looking for cheaper alternatives?
Maybe they'll switch to tea or just start brewing their own at home to save money.
Right. Elasticity helps us figure out how people and businesses will react to these kinds of changes.
So, it's about understanding those relationships, those chain reactions that happen in the economy. That's actually pretty interesting.
It is. And it gets even more interesting when you start thinking about how businesses use this stuff to make decisions.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this matters. So, our notes start off talking about something called price elasticity of demand, or PED. And there's a formula here, but honestly, I'm more of a word person than a numbers person.
Don't worry, we can definitely break it down without getting too lost in the math.
Please do, because math gives me flashbacks to high school exams. Can we just talk about what PED really means before my brain melts?
Absolutely. Basically, PED measures how much the quantity demanded of a product changes when its price changes.
Okay, that makes sense. So, it's a way to quantify how people react to price increases or decreases.
Exactly. Like, if your favorite brand of jeans suddenly goes on sale, will you rush out and buy two pairs, or will you stick with just buying the one pair you need? PED helps us put a number on that reaction.
So, it's about how sensitive people's buying habits are when the price goes up or down.
You got it. And the higher the PED, the more sensitive people are to those price changes.
Makes sense. Now, we have an example here in our notes using something called good A. Its price increased from 1.20 to 1.30, and as a result, the quantity demanded dropped from 80 units to 70. If we plug those numbers into that formula from our notes, we get a PED of negative 1.67. So, what does that tell us? What's the key takeaway here?
Okay, two things to focus on. First, that negative sign. It just means that as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, which is the typical scenario for most goods.
So, we're not talking about those weird things where people actually buy less of something when they have more money to spend, right?
Exactly. We're dealing with what we call normal goods, the things we usually buy more of when our wallets are feeling a bit heavier.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got the negative sign covered. What about that 1.67? What's the significance of that number?
That tells us this is a highly sensitive situation. For every 1% change in price, the demand for good A swings by a whopping 1.67%.
Wow, 1.67%. That's pretty dramatic. So even a small price increase could really shake things up for the company selling this good A.
You bet. And that raises a really important question for any business, really. Should they raise their prices hoping to make more profit per unit, or should they actually lower them to try to attract more buyers?
Ooh, that's $1 million question. Especially if you're dealing with a product where demand is as sensitive as this good A, it seems like they'd really need to be careful.
You're right, they do. In this case, with a PED of 1.67, lowering the price might actually be the smarter move. Even though they'd make less money per unit, they could potentially sell so many more units that they actually increase their overall revenue.
So counterintuitive as it sounds, sometimes lowering your price can actually be the best way to make more money.
Precisely. It's all about maximizing your total revenue, not just focusing on the profit margin of each individual unit.
I'm starting to see how powerful this stuff can be. But hold on, our notes mention something about elasticities changing along the same demand curve. What's that all about?
Ah, that's a great point. It's not always as simple as lower price, more sales.
Oh, really?
The sensitivity to price changes can actually shift at different price points along the curve. So a company really has to dig deep and analyze its specific demand curve to find those sweet spots.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Not at all. Each product, each market has its own unique dynamics.
Okay, definitely a lot more nuance to it than I initially thought. Now, I'm really curious about these demand curves themselves. I see terms like elastic and inelastic, which we've been using, but I'm wondering how those concepts are actually represented visually.
Right. The shape of the demand curve itself tells us a lot about how elastic or inelastic a good is.
So if the demand curve is more elastic, what does that actually look like?
Imagine a pretty flat, almost horizontal line. That's your classic elastic demand curve. And it makes sense if you think about it. If a product has a ton of substitutes, people can easily switch to something else if the price goes up.
Right. It's like if one brand of cereal suddenly gets super expensive, you can just buy a different brand without missing a beat.
Exactly. You're not stuck with that one particular product.
So what about a good that's considered a necessity? I'm guessing the demand curve would look different in that case, right?
You bet. In those cases, the demand curve is much steeper, almost vertical. We call that inelastic demand.
So it's like even if the price goes up, people still got to buy those things because they're essential, like medicine or basic groceries.
You got it. People's buying habits just don't change that much, even if the price does.
Makes sense. Now, our notes also mention some kind of extreme cases like perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic demand. Those sound pretty intense.
They are. A perfectly elastic demand curve is literally a perfectly horizontal line. It basically means any price increase, even a tiny one, will send all the customers running to competitors.
Wow, talk about walking on eggshells. Our notes use the example of homogeneous products.
Perfect example. If two companies are selling the exact same thing, any attempt to charge more will just backfire. The quantity demanded for the pricier one would plummet to zero.
So, perfectly elastic demand is like a high stakes game of limbo. How low can you go? What about perfectly inelastic demand? That must be the opposite extreme, right?
It is. Picture a straight vertical line. This means no matter how much the price changes, the demand stays the same.
Okay, what kind of product would even fit that description?
Think of a life-saving medication with no alternative. People will pay whatever they have to. Or, like our notes mentioned, tickets to the All-Ireland football final.
Oh, yeah, on game day, those things are like gold. Even if the price goes through the roof, diehard fans will find a way to be there.
Exactly. Some things just defy the usual rules of supply and demand.
So it's not just about drawing a downward slope for a demand curve, right? The shape of that slope really matters.
You got it. When you're drawing a demand curve, you have to make sure that shape accurately reflects how elastic or inelastic the good actually is in the real world.
Okay, that was a great breakdown of price elasticity of demand. My brain is definitely feeling a bit less melted now. So where do we go from here on our elasticity adventure?
Now let's shift gears a little and talk about income elasticity of demand, or YED for short.
YED. That sounds like it's related to PED somehow.
You're right on the money. It's basically the same idea, just with a twist. Instead of looking at how demand changes when the price of a good changes, we're analyzing how it changes when people's incomes change.
Okay, so instead of price fluctuations, we're talking about wallets getting thicker or thinner.
Exactly. Like, let's say someone gets a raise. Will they suddenly start buying more of a certain product? Or, if their income drops, will they have to cut back? YED helps us figure that out.
Okay, I'm following so far. It's like seeing how people's buying habits are affected by their overall financial situation.
Right. Let's jump into an example. Our notes mention a scenario where someone's income increases from €100 to 122 a week, and that leads to their consumption of a particular good increasing from 12 units to 14 units.
Okay, so they have a little more money to spend, and they're buying a bit more of this particular thing. Makes sense. So how do we actually figure out the YED in this case?
We can use the YED formula, which, as I mentioned, is quite similar to the PED formula. If we plug in those numbers from our example, we get 0.85.
All right, so what's the story behind that 0.85? What does it tell us?
Well, just like with PED, that causative sign means income and demand are moving in the same direction. As income rises, demand for this particular good also goes up. So we can classify this as a normal good.
Which basically means if someone gets a raise, they're more likely to buy this thing, right? But what if the YED was negative?
That would signal what we call an inferior good.
Inferior good. Sounds kind of harsh.
It's just an economic term. It refers to something that people actually buy less of as their income rises.
Okay, I can see that. So as people earn more, they might switch from, say, generic brands to name brands, or maybe from cheaper cuts of meat to more premium cuts.
You got it. Their preferences shift as their purchasing power increases.
That makes sense. Now, what if the YED wasn't just positive, but was actually greater than 1? Our notes highlight that as a kind of special case.
Ah, that's an interesting one. A YED greater than 1 suggests we're dealing with what economists call a luxury good.
Luxury good. So we're talking champagne wishes and caviar dreams here.
Basically, it means demand for these goods increases at a faster rate than income does. So let's say you get a 10% raise. Your demand for that fancy brand of coffee might jump by 15% or even 20%.
So it's not just that you can afford to buy more of something when you have more money, it's that you specifically choose to buy a proportionally larger amount of that particular thing.
Exactly. It's all about how those spending habits change as income levels go up.
It's like upgrading from a regular latte to a super deluxe version with all the bells and whistles. Okay, this is all starting to come together. We know how to calculate these elasticities and what the numbers mean. But what I'm really curious about is what actually makes a good elastic or inelastic in the first place? Like, what are the underlying factors that are driving these relationships?
That's a key question. And honestly, there are a bunch of different factors that come into play. It's not a simple answer.
Well, I'm ready to get a bit more complicated. Let's dive into those factors. I want to go deeper down this elasticity rabbit hole.
All right, let's do it. So, first and foremost, and we've already touched on this, is whether a good is considered a necessity or a luxury.
Right, because essential goods are generally those things people need no matter what, even if the price goes up.
Exactly. So, demand for essential goods tends to be more inelastic. But with luxury items, people have more flexibility to cut back if they need to.
So the more essential something is, the less people's buying habits will change, even if the price goes up. Okay, that makes sense. What else affects elasticity?
Another big one is the availability of substitutes.
Oh yeah, like with that cereal example we were talking about earlier. If there are a bunch of different brands to choose from, you're not as tied to any one particular brand.
Exactly. If there are lots of substitutes for a product, demand will be more elastic because people have more choices. But if a product is unique, or if there are very few alternatives, the demand will be more inelastic.
Makes sense. So substitutes definitely matter. What about how much of your income you actually spend on a particular good? Does that play a role too?
Absolutely. If something only makes up a tiny fraction of your budget, demand tends to be more inelastic.
Because a few cents here or there won't make a huge difference to your overall spending.
Right. But if a product eats up a big chunk of your income, you're going to be way more sensitive to any price changes.
It's like the difference between buying a pack of gum and buying a new car, right?
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
The stakes are just higher when a larger portion of your income is involved.
Okay, so we've got necessities versus luxuries, substitutes, and the proportion of your income that's spent on a good. What else should we add to our list of things that influence elasticity?
Well, the durability of a product also plays a role.
Durability. So are we talking about how long something lasts?
Exactly. If something lasts a long time, demand tends to be more elastic because people can just put off replacing it if the price is too high.
So if the price of washing machines goes up, I might just keep fixing my old one a little bit longer rather than shelling out for a new one.
Precisely. But if something wears out quickly, people might have to replace it sooner, regardless of the price. So in that case, demand would be more inelastic.
Okay, I see how that works. What about advertising and brand loyalty? Do those things have any impact on elasticity?
Oh, they definitely do. That's where psychology and economics start to overlap.
Interesting. Tell me more.
Clever marketing can really influence people's perceptions. It can create this sense of need or make a product seem more unique or essential, even if similar alternatives exist.
So a really good ad campaign could actually convince me that I absolutely need that new gadget, even if I don't really.
Exactly. And this, in turn, can make the demand for that product less elastic.
Because I'm less likely to switch to a competitor, even if the price goes up.
You got it. Brand loyalty plays a big role, too. If people are fiercely devoted to a certain brand, they might be less sensitive to price changes. They're willing to pay a premium for the brand they love.
So even if the price goes up, a diehard fan might stick with their favorite brand just out of habit or loyalty?
Precisely. Habits can play a role, too, those ingrained patterns of behavior.
Okay, so we've got a lot going on here. Necessities versus luxuries, substitutes, proportion of income, durability, advertising, brand loyalty, even habits. Is there anything else we should add to our list?
Well, our notes also mention something called the elasticity of complements.
Elasticity of complements. Okay, now we're getting a bit fancy. What's that all about?
It's all about how different goods are connected to each other. Complementary goods are things that are usually used together, like cars and gasoline, or printers and ink cartridges.
Right, they go together like peanut butter and jelly.
Exactly. The interesting thing is the elasticity of one good can actually influence the elasticity of its complement.
Oh, really? Can you give us a specific example of how that works?
Sure. Let's say electric cars become super popular, and the demand for gasoline starts to go down as a result. That could then impact the demand for engine oil, which is a complement to gasoline.
Because if people aren't driving gas-powered cars as much, they don't need to buy engine oil as often.
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction. The changes in demand for one good ripple out and affect its complements.
Okay, I can see how those things are all linked. What about the number of uses a product has? Could that affect its elasticity too?
That's a great question. And generally, the more uses a product has, the less elastic its demand tends to be.
So a product that's super versatile, that can be used in a bunch of different ways, will probably have a pretty steady demand even if the price goes up.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Take baking soda, for example. It has a million uses, from baking to cleaning to deodorizing. So even if the price goes up a bit, people are still likely to buy it because it's just so useful.
Okay, it's like the Swiss Army knife of household products. Lots of uses equals steady demand. What about time? Does time play a role in elasticity?
You bet it does. In the short term, demand tends to be more inelastic because people might not have a lot of time to adjust their habits or to find alternatives.
So if the price of something suddenly spikes, people might just have to grit their teeth and pay it because they don't have time to shop around for a better deal.
Exactly. But over the long term, demand becomes more elastic as people have more time to adapt.
Right, they can start looking for substitutes or maybe change their budgets or find ways to just use less of that product.
Got it. So the same product can have different elasticities depending on whether we're looking at the short term or the long term.
Makes sense.
Right.
And that's why those gradual price increases can be so sneaky. If something keeps getting more and more expensive over time, people eventually find ways to adjust without even really noticing it.
Precisely. It's a gradual adaptation.
Okay, before we move on, I want to circle back to advertising for a second. Our notes specifically call out how advertising can actually influence elasticity.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating aspect of it all.
Can you unpack that a bit more for us? How does advertising actually affect elasticity?
Well, a really effective ad campaign can shift the entire demand curve to the right, meaning people are willing to buy more at every price point.
So the demand goes up across the board. That's good news for the company. But I thought we were talking about elasticity here.
We are. And here's the kicker. A good ad campaign can also make the demand curve less elastic.
Wait, hold on. So advertising can both boost demand and make people less sensitive to price changes. How does that work?
Think about it. By building strong brand loyalty, highlighting unique features, or even just making the product more familiar, advertising can reduce people's willingness to switch to a competitor, even if the price goes up.
So good advertising can make a product seem almost essential, even if it really isn't.
You could say that.
Yeah.
It's a testament to the power of marketing to shape our perceptions and our choices.
Wow, this really is fascinating stuff. We've spent a lot of time on the demand side of things, how consumers react to changes in price. But there's another side to this story, right? What about the suppliers, the companies that are actually producing these goods? They must be reacting to price changes too.
Absolutely. They are. And that's where things get even more interesting. It's time to explore the supply side of elasticity.
Lead the way. I'm ready to see how the other half of this economic equation works.
Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about price elasticity of supply. It's all about how producers, the companies making and selling stuff, how they respond to price changes.
Okay, I'm with you. So are we saying that when the price of something goes up, companies will just automatically produce more of it to take advantage of that higher price?
Well, it's not quite that simple. There are limits to how quickly and easily producers can adjust their output.
Right, because sometimes things are more complicated than they seem. So what are we really trying to figure out here?
We're basically asking, how sensitive is the quantity supplied of a product to changes in its price? Do producers ramp up production when prices are high, or are there constraints that prevent them from doing that?
So just like with demand, we're talking about sensitivity and responsiveness.
Exactly. It's just a different perspective. We're looking at the supply side of the equation now.
Okay, I'm following. And do we have a snazzy formula for this too? Like with PED?
Of course we do. Economists love their formulas. And it's actually very similar in structure to the PED formula.
Well, I'm sure it's all very logical and elegant. So let's test it out. Our notes give an example. The price of a product increases from 20 to 30 euro, And in response, the quantity supplied jumps from 100 units to 180 units.
Perfect example. So if we plug those numbers into our handy-dandy price elasticity of supply formula, we get an elasticity of, drumroll please, 1.43.
All right, 1.43. What's the verdict? What does that tell us about this particular scenario?
That 1.43 indicates that the supply of this product is pretty elastic. It means that for every 1% change in price, the quantity supplied changes by 1.43%.
Okay, so in plain English, that means that producers in this market can respond pretty quickly and easily to changes in price, right? If the price goes up, they can increase production without too much hassle.
Exactly. They're agile, they're adaptable.
And that's generally a good thing, right? Flexibility is usually a good thing in business.
It definitely can be. But just like with demand, there are a bunch of different factors that can influence the elasticity of supply.
Okay, so it's not always as straightforward as higher price, more production.
Not always. Sometimes there are roadblocks or limitations that prevent producers from increasing their output, even if they want to.
So what kind of things are we talking about here? What are some of those factors that can make supply more or less elastic?
Our notes have a whole list, so let's dive right in. First up, we have the specialization of labor and capital. This is basically about how specialized the inputs are that a company needs to make its product.
Okay, so in some industries, companies need really highly skilled workers or specialized equipment to get the job done.
Exactly. And that can make it harder for them to quickly adjust their production levels, even if prices are rising and they're eager to cash in.
I guess it takes time to train skilled workers or to get new customized equipment up and running.
You got it. So in industries that rely on a lot of specialized labor and capital, the supply will generally be more inelastic, at least in the short run.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about a company's current operating capacity? Does that affect how elastic its supply is?
Absolutely. If a company is already running at full capacity, meaning they're using all of their resources to the max, they can't just magically produce more, even if the price of their product skyrockets.
So even if they want to produce more, they're limited by what they can actually do given their current setup.
Precisely. They might hit a ceiling in terms of their factory size, the number of employees they have, or even just the availability of the raw materials they need.
So in those cases, supply would be pretty inelastic.
You bet. At least until they can invest in expanding their operations. They might need to build a new factory or hire more workers before they can significantly increase their output.
It sounds like time is a big factor in all of this.
You're absolutely right. The time frame we're considering is crucial. In the short run, supply is often more inelastic because companies just don't have enough time to react and make big changes. But over the long run, they have more flexibility to adapt, to invest in new equipment or facilities, and to maybe even change their production processes.
So if a company plays its cards right, it can eventually overcome those short-term constraints and become more responsive to changes in price.
Exactly. It's all about taking that long-term perspective. It's like the difference between making a quick, reactive decision in a crisis and taking the time to strategize and plan for the future.
Okay, so we've talked about specialization, operating capacity, and the time factor. What other things can influence how elastic a company's supply is?
Well, another important factor is the mobility of factors of production.
Okay, break that down for us. What do we mean by mobility of factors of production?
We're basically talking about how easy it is to move or reallocate the resources that are needed to produce a good. Things like labor, capital, and raw materials.
So if a company can easily get the workers, the equipment, and the materials they need, their supply will be more elastic because they can quickly adapt to changing market conditions.
Exactly. But if those resources are scarce, or if they're difficult to transport, or if they're already being used for something else, then the company's supply will be less responsive to price changes.
It's like trying to bake a cake, but realizing you're out of eggs and the grocery store is closed. You're stuck.
Perfect analogy. Sometimes you just don't have the ingredients you need, no matter how badly you want to bake that cake.
Okay, so mobility matters. What about the nature of the product itself? Does that play a role in elasticity of supply?
It absolutely does. Some products are just inherently more difficult to produce than others, and that can affect how quickly and easily producers can respond to price changes.
Like with agricultural products, right? A farmer can't just instantly grow more wheat or corn overnight, even if the price suddenly goes way up.
Exactly. Agricultural production is often tied to natural cycles and time lags. It takes time to plant, grow, and harvest crops.
So even if farmers are eager to cash in on higher prices, Mother Nature might have other plans.
You could say that. In many cases, the supply of agricultural products is relatively inelastic, at least in the short run.
Okay, so sometimes it's a waiting game. What about in the long term? Can farmers adapt to those price changes eventually?
Over a longer period, they might be able to. They could adjust their planting decisions or invest in new technology to increase their yields, or maybe even switch to different crops that are more profitable in the current market.
So even products that seem pretty fixed in the short run can become more elastic over time.
Exactly. It's a reminder that these economic concepts aren't static. They're dynamic and ever-changing, and the time frame we're considering really matters.
Okay, so we've got specialization, operating capacity, time, resource mobility, and the nature of the product itself, all influencing a company's ability to respond to price changes. Anything else we should be aware of?
We're not quite done yet. There are a few more factors worth mentioning. One is government regulations.
Yes, the red tape.
Exactly. Sometimes those regulations can create hurdles for companies that want to increase production.
So even if a company is eager to ramp things up, they might have to jump through a bunch of bureaucratic hoops first, and that can definitely slow things down.
You got it. So in industries that are heavily regulated, the supply might be less elastic.
Okay, makes sense. What about storage possibilities? Could that influence elasticity too?
Absolutely. Think about it. If a company can easily store its products, it can build up inventory when prices are low and then sell more when prices are high. It's like playing the market, but with actual physical goods.
So smart. It's like having a secret stash of stuff ready to go when the time is right.
Exactly. And that kind of flexibility definitely makes the company's supply more elastic. They can respond to price changes more effectively because they have that cushion of inventory.
But if storage is expensive, or if it's difficult for a particular product, then that could limit a company's ability to respond to price changes.
You bet. Not all products are created equal when it comes to storage.
Okay, I see how that makes a difference. What about the number of producers in the market? Does competition play a role in elasticity of supply?
It definitely does. If there are a lot of different companies making a similar product, the overall supply will generally be more elastic because there's more competition.
So if one company isn't able to increase its production quickly enough to meet demand, other companies can jump in and fill the gap.
Exactly. It's like a race to see who can get those products to market first.
And consumers benefit from that competition, right? Because it helps to keep prices down.
Exactly. Competition is a beautiful thing in a market economy. Now, on the flip side, if there are only a few producers or if one company dominates the market, the overall supply might be less elastic because there are fewer options for increasing production quickly.
So a lack of competition can lead to a less responsive supply, which isn't so great for consumers.
Right. It can create a situation where the producers have more power to dictate prices.
This has been an incredible deep dive into elasticities. We've gone from figuring out how consumers react to price changes to understanding all the complex factors that can influence how companies respond on the supply side. It's pretty amazing how interconnected everything is. Like, who would have thought that government regulations and storage capabilities could have such a big impact on how a market functions?
Right. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Or maybe a better analogy would be a complex ecosystem where all these different elements are interconnected and interacting with each other.
I love that. It's a reminder that economics isn't just about numbers and formulas. It's about understanding those dynamic relationships between buyers and sellers, prices and quantities, short-term constraints, and long-term possibilities.
You got it. And once you start to see those connections, you start to see elasticities everywhere.
I already feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new way. Our examples, good A, income changes, all those factors influencing elasticity, they've really helped me grasp the core concepts. But I'm wondering, how could someone use this knowledge in their own life beyond just understanding economic theory?
That's a wonderful question. And it gets to the heart of why we do these deep dives in the first place. Understanding elasticities can actually empower you to make more informed decisions in all sorts of contexts.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Give us some examples. How could someone actually apply these ideas in the real world?
Well, as a consumer, you can use the concept of elasticity to anticipate how prices might change in the future.
Okay, so like if I know a certain product has a very elastic demand, I might wait for a sale or shop around for the best deal because I know that sellers will be sensitive to price differences and will be competing to get my business.
Exactly. You're leveraging your knowledge of elasticities to become a savvier shopper.
I like it. So it's not just about abstract concepts, it's about real-world decision-making.
Right. And it's not just about shopping either. If you're a student, understanding elasticities can help you think more critically about how different events or policies might impact various industries or markets.
So you can start to see the ripple effects of economic decisions.
Precisely. And even in your future career, no matter what field you go into, having a solid grasp of these concepts can give you a valuable edge.
Like how so?
Well, you'll be able to analyze market trends more effectively, anticipate your competitors' behavior, and ultimately make more strategic decisions.
I'm starting to see how this can be a really powerful tool in anyone's arsenal. It's like having a secret decoder ring for the economy.
It kind of is. And that's what makes economics so fascinating. It's not just about numbers and formulas. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world and using that knowledge to make better choices.
I'm feeling inspired to go out and apply these concepts, but before we wrap things up, I have one final question that's been swirling in my mind. We've been talking about how understanding elasticity can help us be smarter shoppers and make better business decisions. But what about on a bigger scale? Like, how does the concept of elasticity play out in the realm of government policy and, big economic decisions?
You're thinking about the big picture now.
Yeah.
I like it. That's a fantastic question. And it takes us into the realm of how economics can actually be used to shape the world around us.
Okay, cool. So how do policymakers actually use these ideas?
Well, they use the concept of elasticity all the time to try to figure out what the impact of their decisions might be. Like, will a certain policy actually have the intended effect, or will it backfire and create unintended consequences?
I can see how that would be important to know.
Right. Nobody wants to make a decision that ends up making things worse. So one area where elasticity plays a big role is in taxation.
Okay, taxes, everyone's favorite topic.
Right. But seriously, governments often use taxes to try to do two main things: to raise revenue, obviously, but also to influence behavior.
So, like, if the government wants to discourage people from smoking, they might raise taxes on cigarettes, hoping that people will buy fewer cigarettes as a result.
Exactly. That's a classic example. But here's where elasticity comes in. The success of that tax, in terms of actually reducing smoking rates, really hinges on the price elasticity of demand for cigarettes.
So, are we saying that if people are really addicted to cigarettes, they might just keep buying them anyway, even if the price goes up?
That's exactly what we're saying. If the demand for cigarettes is inelastic, meaning people aren't that sensitive to price changes, then the tax might not actually reduce smoking that much.
People might grumble about the higher price, but they'll still cough up the money to get their nicotine fix.
Precisely. But if the demand is elastic, meaning people are more sensitive to those price changes, then a tax could be a more effective tool for reducing smoking rates.
Because people might start looking for alternatives like vaping or nicotine patches, or maybe even try to quit altogether if the price gets too high.
Right, so policymakers have to carefully consider those elasticities when they're crafting tax policies. It's not just about raising revenue, it's about understanding how people might respond to those price changes.
This is really interesting. So, what other policy areas might be influenced by these concepts?
Well, think about subsidies. Governments often give subsidies to try to encourage certain behaviors or to support certain industries.
Right. So, they might give subsidies to farmers to encourage them to grow certain crops, or to renewable energy companies to make solar panels more affordable.
Exactly. But just like with taxes, the effectiveness of those subsidies depends heavily on elasticity.
Okay, so walk us through it. How does elasticity play into this?
Let's take the solar panel example. If the government offers subsidies to solar panel manufacturers, the impact of those subsidies will depend on the elasticity of supply.
So, if the supply of solar panels is elastic, that means companies can easily increase their production in response to those subsidies.
You got it. And that increased production could lead to lower prices for consumers, which would make solar panels more accessible and encourage more people to adopt them.
But what if the supply is inelastic?
Well, in that case, even with the subsidies, companies might struggle to ramp up production quickly.
Because they might be limited by things like factory capacity, or the availability of specialized materials, or a shortage of skilled workers.
Exactly. Those constraints could create bottlenecks in the supply chain, or lead to delays, or just result in very modest increases in production.
So those subsidies might not have as big of an impact as policymakers were hoping for.
Right. It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, policies don't always play out as expected. And understanding elasticity can help policymakers anticipate those challenges and make more informed decisions.
I'm starting to see how understanding elasticities gives policymakers this powerful tool to analyze what might happen when they intervene in the market. It's like a way to peek into the future and see how different players might react.
It's not a crystal ball, but it definitely helps to shed light on those complex relationships between cause and effect in the economy.
And it's not just about predicting the overall impact of a policy, right? It's also about understanding the distribution of those impacts.
Ah, that's a really important point. You're thinking like a true economist now.
Well, I'm trying. So what do you mean by distribution of impacts?
I mean, who actually benefits from a policy and who ends up bearing the costs? Like, let's go back to that sugary drinks tax we were talking about earlier. If the demand for sugary drinks is inelastic, who do you think is going to end up paying more for those drinks?
It would be the consumers, right? Because if they're not that sensitive to price changes, they're the ones who are going to end up shouldering the burden of that tax.
Exactly. But if the demand is elastic, the burden of that tax might actually shift more toward the producers.
Because they might have to lower their prices a bit to avoid losing too many customers.
Precisely. They might have to absorb some of that tax themselves. So understanding elasticities can help policymakers to figure out not just what the overall impact of a policy might be, but also who's going to come out ahead and who's going to end up paying the price, so to speak.
This is so cool. It's like economics meets detective work.
It kind of is. It's about understanding incentives and trade-offs and all the intricate ways that people and businesses respond to changes in the world around them.
Wow, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've gone from calculating elasticities to actually seeing how those numbers translate into real-world decisions.
It's all connected.
I feel like I'm equipped with a whole new set of tools to navigate the complexities of the economy now.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn and more to explore.
I'm ready to keep learning. So, to everyone listening out there, I encourage you to take these ideas about elasticity and start applying them in your own lives. Pay attention to how prices change, observe how businesses respond to those changes, and think about how your own choices are being influenced by these forces. You might be surprised by how much you start to notice.
And don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge assumptions, dig deeper, and keep exploring the fascinating world of economics. There's always something new to discover.
Well said. That's it for our deep dive into elasticities for today. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.